In this lesson, we will talk about some of the challenges with motion blur and some of the mistakes to avoid when working with it. Okay, so I'm just starting off right here in 08_begin in the After Effects project files, and this is already going to have everything in it that we need for this lesson, just already imported over here in our project panel. So one of the first things I want to talk about is motion blur and kind of how it relates to this shot here. So first of all, motion blur is the blurring effect that's caused by fast motion in video or in your motion graphics if you've added it. And it really makes it just feel more realistic and gives the illusion that everything's moving around really quickly. So if I kind of scrub forward there, you see that as the camera begins to move away from this first area and onto the second part of the shot, we get a lot of blur for these two objects here. But one of the mistakes that you'll notice in this shot is that there's some other objects that should have blur and they don't have it turned on. So I want to go ahead and turn on the motion blur switch for those layers. So this little circle here that's on the edge of that graph and also the graph itself should both have motion blur turned on. That's going to be this little switch that you see right there. So I turned both of those switches on and now my whole shot just about has motion blur on it. But my little percentage sign still doesn't have the motion blur turned on, so we need to turn it on for this layer as well. But you can't see it right now because it is inside of this pre-composed layer. Now this pre-composed layer has motion blur on other parts, but not on the percentage sign itself. So we need to go inside of that composition to turn it on for the percent sign. So go ahead and double click the 3 shapes pre-composed layer. And you'll see that right there, that little percent sign doesn't have its motion blur switch checked. So I'll go ahead and check that. And even though there's not a lot of motion happening inside of this pre-composed situation here, out on the outside, if we come back out to graph, we have lots of motion happening with our camera. So we need that motion blur switched on inside of that comp. So now my entire shot is unified simply because I've switched on motion blur for all those layers that are being affected by this large sweeping motion that we have from our camera. Now, what if we had shot a piece of video footage and we wanted it to have more motion blur than it had when we shot it? Let's move on to one of our other compositions and talk about how we would add motion blur to a shot like that. So I'm going to go ahead and close out of this graph and the 3 shapes, and we'll stick right here in the library pan comp. Now, if you don't have that open in yours, you can just come down to compositions, and all of those comps that we're working in are right there in the project panel. So let's do just a quick run preview of the shot and watch it through. Now it does have a little bit of motion blur that's happening naturally just kind of up here, but what if we want it to feel like it's moving a little bit more quickly than what we have already given it? So I'm going to add an effect that's going to add some more motion blur to this piece of footage, and that's the time warp effect. So we're going to come up here to Window and open up the Effects and Presets panel. So go ahead and click that. And just right up here in the search bar, we can type in time warp, and it's going to bring that effect up for us. So go ahead and grab that, and we'll just drop it onto our piece of footage. Now, what automatically happens whenever you add time warp is it's going to take that speed back down to 50% of the original speed. Now, I didn't want to change how long the duration of my clip was, so I'm going to come back up here and where that says speed, just change that to 100. So that's kind of just one of the things you want to keep in mind whenever you're working with time warp. So to get the motion blur for a piece of footage like this, you can't just switch on that motion blur switch like we did earlier, because After Effects isn't going to recognize the motion within a shot. To After Effects, this is just a static image, and it doesn't see that there's any kind of motion that its motion blur switch would change. So we need to change the motion blur settings inside of our time warp effect to affect what's actually going on in our shot. So to do that, I'm going to come down here and we see that we have a motion blur property. So I'm just going to check this box that says enable motion blur, and that's going to get me started. Now, I also want to change where it says shutter control from automatic to manual. And we see that that gave us just a little bit more blur there whenever I changed that. And now we also have the option to change our shutter angle and our shutter samples. So if I want to make this even more blurry than we started out with, I simply need to turn up the shutter angle property. So right now that's sitting at 180, and maybe I want to crank this up to something like 500. So I'm just going to click that and type it in. And we see that now we get a lot more motion blur all across that shot in this part that has quite a bit of motion in it. So as I kind of come down here, we start to see that this area where it's not moving quite so fast doesn't have as much motion blur. And this property is able to be keyed as well. So maybe if I want the motion blur to really start going away once I get to this point, I could go ahead and set a key there for the shutter angle just by clicking that stopwatch, then move forward a little bit and change that back to 180, which is just that default value. And that's going to slow down that motion blur over time. So it's going to take a little bit to calculate this, and that's one of the drawbacks of just using an effect to give you this motion blur. But it's going to be worth it in the end if you're really going for a look that's going to feel really fast. So I'll let this RAM preview kind of calculate out, and then we'll be able to see how over time, since we keyed that motion blur property, you can see it slowing down as the motion blur kind of dissipates from that 500 value to the value 180. Okay, so my RAM preview is finished now, and you can watch this through. And we see that as we kind of come down here to our subject, the motion blur goes away, and we kind of just ease into this last piece of our shot. So definitely an easy way for us to add that motion blur if we know how to work this effect. Now there's a third way that we can add motion blur to our images, and that's with another effect called CC Force Motion Blur. So I'm going to come over here to this other composition that we have, to this circle reveal. Now this particular kind of circle that I'm revealing here has to have motion blur applied to it with an effect because of the way that the effects that have already been applied to it, simply to make it look like this, interact with other effects. So you'll notice if I come in here to the red solid that's creating that circle and try to turn on motion blur, turn on my motion blur switch, nothing happens. We don't get any kind of motion blur here on that edge that's moving. And if I add the time warp to this red solid, we'll see that that makes our circle completely go away and gets rid of our other effect that we had creating that circle. So I have to use my CC Force Motion Blur effect to create a motion blur for this type of circle. Now, CC Force Motion Blur can be found in the same way that we found our time warp effect, just by typing it in right there at the top. So I'll go ahead and grab that, and we'll drop that onto our red solid. And we see that we get a little bit of motion blur right there along that edge. So I can go ahead and do a RAM preview, and you can see really quickly how that effect, even over time, dissipates as it begins to slow down. So it's really helpful whenever you're creating something that you're wanting to add motion blur to, but different effects aren't working and After Effects default motion blur isn't working. Try to use CC Force Motion Blur and see what happens. Now I could have also used CC Force Motion Blur to add motion blur to my piece of footage earlier. That would work either way, but sometimes when you have more tricky effects like this, you have to go with a specific kind of effect because nothing else will work. And this actually takes a little bit less time to calculate also, so sometimes using CC Force Motion Blur instead of time warp for motion blur is going to give you better results overall. So in this lesson, we learned some of the issues that arise when you want to use motion blur and what to look out for as you use these different effects and switches to make your animations and live footage look more believable.